The sun was setting behind the tall oak trees that surrounded Sunset Manor Nursing Home in rural Tennessee. Inside the peaceful facility, elderly residents were finishing their dinner in the main dining hall. The smell of roast chicken and mashed potatoes filled the air as nurses helped some of the older folks back to their rooms for the evening. Among the residents were 8 men who sat together at their usual corner table. These weren't ordinary nursing home residents. Frank Morrison, age 89, still carried himself with military precision despite his walker. Next to him sat Tommy Chen, 87, whose sharp eyes constantly scanned the room out of habit. There was also Red Patterson, 91, who got his nickname from his bright red hair that had now turned silver. The group included Miguel Santos, 88, James Bulldog Williams, 90, Robert Kim, 86, Eddie Foster, 89, and the youngest of them all, David Park, 84. What made these 8 men special wasn't just their age or their friendship. They were all veterans of the Korean War, and they had served together in some of the most brutal battles of that conflict. Even now, decades later, they maintained the brotherhood they had forged in the frozen mountains of Korea. They met every evening for dinner, sharing stories and keeping each other's spirits up. The nursing home staff knew about their military background, but most people saw them as just another group of elderly men who needed help with daily activities. Frank used oxygen occasionally for his breathing problems. Tommy had arthritis that made his hands shake. Red needed help getting around after his hip replacement. To most people, they looked like fragile old men who posed no threat to anyone. But appearances can be deceiving. These men had survived the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, one of the most challenging military campaigns in American history. They had fought in freezing temperatures against overwhelming odds. They had seen their friends die and had to make life or death decisions every day for months. The experiences had changed them forever, creating an unbreakable bond between them. The nursing home itself was located about 20 miles outside of Nashville, surrounded by farmland and forests. It was a quiet place where families sent their elderly relatives to receive proper care. The facility housed about 60 residents and employed 15 staff members during the day shift, but only 5 during the night shift. The building was old but well-maintained, with long hallways connecting different wings for residents with various care needs. As the evening progressed, most residents were settling into their rooms for the night. The 8 veterans, however, had developed a routine of staying up later than the others. They would move to the common room where they could talk more freely, and sometimes watch old war movies together. Tonight felt different, though. Frank had noticed a strange car parked across the street earlier in the day. Tommy had seen the same unfamiliar faces in the parking lot twice this week. Their military training had taught them to notice details that others might miss. Something was wrong, but they couldn't put their finger on exactly what it was. The feeling made them more alert than usual. They decided to stay in the common room a little longer tonight, keeping an eye on things. The nursing home's security system was basic. Just a few cameras at the main entrances and a simple lock system on the doors. The facility had never experienced any serious security problems before. Crime was rare in this rural area, and most people considered the nursing home a safe place where nothing exciting ever happened. As the clock struck 9 in the evening, the day shift staff began leaving for home. The night nurse, Sarah Martinez, was making her rounds to check on residents. 2 care assistants, Jennifer and Michael, were helping residents who needed assistance getting ready for bed. The security guard, Bob Thompson, was an older man who mostly spent his shift reading magazines at the front desk. None of the staff members noticed the dark van that had been parked down the road for the past hour. Inside the van, 6 men were making final preparations for what they thought would be an easy job. They had been hired to rob the nursing home. Believing it would be simple to intimidate elderly residents and overwhelmed staff into giving them access to the facility's safe and any valuable medications they could find. The leader of the group, Marcus Webb, had planned this robbery for weeks. He knew the nursing home's schedule, the number of staff members on duty at night, and the location of the main safe in the administrator's office. What he didn't know was the military background of the 8 men who were still awake in the common room. Webb's team consisted of experienced criminals who had robbed several businesses in the area over the past year. They were armed and dangerous, but they expected no resistance from a nursing home full of elderly people and a handful of medical staff. They had chosen this target specifically because they thought it would be an easy score with minimal risk. As the clock approached 10, the 6 gunmen finally made their move. They approached the nursing home's main entrance, confident that they would be in and out within 30 minutes with everything they wanted. They had no idea that their simple robbery was about to become the fight of their lives against 8 men who had never learned how to surrender. The 6 gunmen moved through the darkness like shadows, their faces covered with black masks. Marcus Webb led the way, followed by his most trusted associates: Carlos Rivera, a man with multiple robbery convictions; Jake Sullivan, known for his violent temper; Dean Morris, the group's electronics expert; Tony Russo, their lookout; and Kyle Thompson, the youngest member who was desperate to prove himself to the others. They had studied the nursing home's layout for weeks. Webb knew that the main entrance would be unlocked until 10:30, when the night security guard would make his final rounds and lock everything down for the night. The plan was simple: get inside before lockdown, intimidate the staff and residents, force someone to open the safe, grab whatever medications they could find, and escape before police could respond to any alarm. As they approached the building, Dean Morris quickly disabled the external security cameras using a small device he had brought. The cameras weren't sophisticated, and it took him less than 2 minutes to loop old footage so their approach wouldn't be recorded. Tony Russo stayed outside near their van, watching for any signs of police or unexpected visitors. The 5 remaining gunmen entered through the main doors at exactly 10:15. The lobby was dimly lit, with only a few table lamps providing gentle lighting for residents who might need to move around at night. Bob Thompson, the security guard, was dozing in his chair behind the front desk. A small television was playing an old Western movie at low volume. Webb signaled for silence as they moved past the sleeping guard. Their plan was to secure the building quietly before announcing their presence. Sullivan and Morris headed toward the staff areas to find the night nurse and care assistants. Rivera moved toward the administrative offices to locate the safe. Webb and the young Kyle Thompson began moving through the resident areas to ensure no one could call for help. But the 8 veterans in the common room had heard something that the criminals didn't expect anyone to notice. Frank Morrison's hearing might not have been perfect anymore, but his military-trained ears caught the sound of multiple footsteps moving in formation down the hallway. It was a pattern he recognized from decades ago: the careful, coordinated movement of men trying to stay hidden. Tommy Chen noticed it too. He gestured silently to the others, using hand signals they had learned in Korea and somehow never forgotten. Red Patterson quietly moved his wheelchair closer to the window to get a better view of the parking lot. Miguel Santos positioned himself near the common room's back exit. The other 4 men spread out strategically around the room without making a sound. These weren't confused elderly men anymore. In an instant, they had transformed back into the soldiers they had once been. Their bodies might have been older and slower, but their minds were sharp and their instincts were intact. They communicated with gestures and whispers, falling back on training that had kept them alive in one of America's most challenging wars. Frank Morrison took charge naturally, just as he had done as their sergeant in Korea. He pointed toward the hallway where they could now hear voices. Someone was giving quiet orders in the distance. Tommy Chen confirmed what they were all thinking with a simple nod. These weren't medical staff or late visitors. These were intruders, and they were armed. Webb and Kyle Thompson were moving down the main hallway when they encountered their first problem. Mrs. Elizabeth Harper, an 83-year-old resident with insomnia, had left her room to get a glass of water from the kitchen. She saw the 2 masked men and immediately understood that something was very wrong. Before Webb could stop her, she screamed. The scream echoed through the building, waking residents and alerting the night staff. Sarah Martinez, the night nurse, immediately grabbed the emergency phone to call 911. But Dean Morris had anticipated this possibility. He had already cut the main phone lines to the building, and the cellular signal in this rural area was weak at best. Sullivan kicked in the door to the nurse's station, pointing his gun at Sarah and the 2 care assistants. "Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt," he shouted. "We just want what's in the safe and then we're gone." But the situation was already spiraling out of control. Residents throughout the building were waking up, confused and frightened. Some began calling out for help. Others tried to lock themselves in their rooms. The carefully planned quiet robbery was turning into chaos. In the common room, the 8 veterans heard the scream and the shouting. They knew they had only minutes before the gunmen would reach their area of the building. Frank Morrison made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who saw these men as helpless elderly residents. "Gentlemen," he whispered to his old comrades, "we've got hostiles in the building. Staff and residents are in danger. What do you say we handle this the way we used to?" The response was immediate and unanimous. These 8 men had survived the Korean War by looking out for each other and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Age and illness hadn't changed their fundamental character. They were still soldiers, and soldiers don't abandon their post when people need protection. Red Patterson rolled his wheelchair to block the main entrance to the common room. Miguel Santos found the fire extinguisher and tested its weight in his hands. James Williams positioned himself behind an overturned table. The others spread out to create overlapping fields of observation and defense. They could hear Webb and Kyle Thompson getting closer, checking rooms and demanding that residents stay in bed. The criminals had no idea what they were walking into. They expected to find frightened elderly people who would comply with their demands. Instead, they were about to encounter 8 men who had never learned the meaning of surrender. Webb and Kyle Thompson rounded the corner toward the common room, expecting to find it empty or occupied by a few frightened elderly residents. Instead, they found themselves facing what appeared to be a carefully organized defensive position. 8 men had positioned themselves strategically around the room, and something about their posture and alertness immediately told Webb that these weren't ordinary nursing home residents. "What the hell?" Kyle whispered, raising his gun uncertainly. He had expected scared old people begging for mercy, not this organized resistance. Frank Morrison stepped forward, his walker abandoned beside an overturned chair. Despite his age and the oxygen tank he sometimes needed, he stood with the bearing of a man who had commanded soldiers in combat. "I suggest you boys turn around and walk away while you still can," he said calmly. Webb laughed, though there was nervousness in his voice. "Old man, you're in no position to make suggestions. Get on the ground, all of you, and nobody gets hurt." But Tommy Chen had already moved. Despite his arthritis, his muscle memory kicked in as he used a lamp to create a distraction, throwing it toward the far wall. In the split second that Kyle Thompson looked toward the noise, Red Patterson wheeled his chair directly into the young criminal's legs, sending him stumbling backward. The gun flew from Kyle's hands as he fell, sliding across the floor toward Miguel Santos, who scooped it up with surprising agility. Webb spun around, trying to aim at multiple targets at once, but found himself surrounded by men who were moving with purpose and coordination that defied their apparent physical limitations. "Carlos, Jake, get in here now," Webb shouted into his radio, realizing that his easy robbery had just become a serious problem. Meanwhile, Sullivan and Morris were having their own difficulties in the staff area. Sarah Martinez, the night nurse, had managed to activate a silent alarm that connected directly to the local sheriff's department before the phone lines were cut. The 2 care assistants, Jennifer and Michael, had barricaded themselves in a supply closet and were refusing to come out. Rivera had found the safe in the administrator's office, but it was a newer model with digital locks that he couldn't crack without the proper codes. He was growing frustrated, smashing desk drawers and searching for any written combination numbers. Back in the common room, the situation was escalating rapidly. David Park, the youngest of the veterans at 84, had positioned himself near the room's back exit. When he heard Webb calling for backup, he made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He slipped out the back door and began moving through the building's rear corridors toward the staff area. Park's plan was to help the nursing staff and try to even the odds. His knees ached with every step and his heart was pounding harder than it had in years, but he felt more alive than he had since arriving at the nursing home. This was what he had trained for 60 years ago, and the skills were still there. Webb was becoming increasingly agitated as he tried to control 8 men who clearly weren't intimidated by his weapon. Eddie Foster had managed to get behind a heavy bookshelf and was systematically pushing it toward Webb's position. Robert Kim was using his cane as a weapon, keeping Kyle Thompson on the ground and preventing him from reaching for a backup weapon. "You old fools don't understand," Webb shouted. "I've got 5 more men in this building. You can't fight all of us." James Bulldog Williams laughed, a sound that held no humor whatsoever. "Son, we fought the Chinese army in Korea when we were outnumbered 50 to 1. "6 punks with guns don't scare us much." The comment made Webb realize that he wasn't dealing with typical nursing home residents. These men were veterans, and they were treating this situation like a military engagement. His simple robbery was turning into a battle with men who had actual combat experience. Carlos Rivera came running in response to Webb's radio call, but he stopped short when he saw the scene in the common room. One of his team members was on the ground, disarmed and being controlled by an elderly man with a cane. His leader was backed against a wall by men who were moving in coordinated patterns despite their walkers and wheelchairs. "What the hell is going on here?" Rivera demanded, raising his own weapon. But Frank Morrison had anticipated the arrival of backup. He had positioned Tommy Chen near the entrance specifically to handle this situation. As Rivera entered the room, Tommy used an old Korean war trick, throwing his jacket over Rivera's head and pulling him off balance. Miguel Santos, still holding Kyle's gun, quickly relieved Rivera of his weapon as well. Now the criminals were in serious trouble. 2 of their 6-man team were disarmed and controlled by elderly veterans who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. Webb was trapped in a defensive position, and the other 3 team members were scattered throughout the building dealing with their own problems. David Park had reached the staff area and found Sarah Martinez hiding behind an overturned desk while Sullivan and Morris searched for her. Park might have been 84 years old, but he still remembered how to move quietly. He approached Sullivan from behind and used a technique he had learned in hand-to-hand combat training. Sullivan never saw him coming. Park grabbed a heavy medical equipment stand and brought it down on Sullivan's gun hand, causing him to drop his weapon and cry out in pain. Morris spun around in shock, amazed to see an elderly man in pajamas attacking his partner. "Sarah, run," Park shouted to the nurse. "Get to a phone and call for help." Morris aimed his gun at Park, but the old veteran was already moving, using the medical equipment and furniture as cover. Park might not have been as fast as he once was, but he was smart and experienced. He knew how to use his environment to his advantage. The nursing home had become a battlefield, with 6 criminals finding themselves outmaneuvered by 8 elderly men who refused to be victims. The veterans were using tactics they had learned in one of America's most challenging wars, adapted to the hallways and rooms of a peaceful nursing facility. Outside, Tony Russo was growing nervous. He could hear shouting and commotion from inside the building, but his radio communications with the team were becoming chaotic and confusing. The simple 30-minute robbery was taking much longer than planned, and something was clearly going very wrong. The nursing home had transformed into a war zone, but it wasn't the kind of battle the 6 gunmen had expected. Dean Morris fired a shot at David Park, but the bullet went wide, striking a wall instead. The sound of gunfire echoed through the building, terrifying the other residents but galvanizing the 8 veterans into even more determined action. Park used the moment when Morris was aiming to close the distance between them. Moving faster than anyone would have thought possible for an 84-year-old man, he tackled Morris around the waist, sending both of them crashing into a medical cart. Bottles and supplies scattered across the floor as the 2 men struggled for control of the gun. In the common room, Frank Morrison was coordinating his men like the sergeant he had once been. "Tommy, Red, keep those 2 secured," he ordered, indicating the disarmed criminals. "Miguel, Eddie, we need to help David. James, Robert, watch the entrances." But Webb still had his gun and was growing desperate. He fired 2 shots toward the ceiling, hoping to regain control of the situation through intimidation. "Everyone stop moving or I start shooting people," he screamed. The veterans didn't stop moving. If anything, the gunfire made them more focused. These men had been shot at by North Korean and Chinese soldiers for months during the war. The sound of bullets didn't make them freeze in terror. It made them remember their training and react accordingly. Robert Kim used his cane to hook Webb's ankle, pulling the criminal off balance. As Webb stumbled, James Williams moved in despite his own physical limitations. Williams might have needed help getting around the nursing home during normal days, but in this moment, he was channeling the strength he had once used to carry wounded soldiers through frozen mountains. Meanwhile, Tony Russo outside was receiving increasingly frantic radio calls from his teammates inside. The robbery that was supposed to take 30 minutes had been going on for nearly an hour, and nothing was going according to plan. He could see lights coming on in nearby houses as the sound of gunfire woke up neighbors. Russo made a decision that would prove to be a critical mistake. Instead of telling his team to abort the mission and escape, he decided to enter the building himself to help them. He grabbed an extra weapon from the van and headed toward the nursing home's rear entrance. David Park and Dean Morris were still struggling on the floor when Park heard footsteps approaching from behind. His combat instincts kicked in and he managed to roll away just as Tony Russo appeared in the doorway. Park might have been old, but his mind was still sharp. He grabbed a bedpan from the scattered medical supplies and threw it with surprising accuracy, hitting Russo in the face and temporarily blinding him. The distraction was enough for Park to finally wrestle the gun away from Morris. Now 3 of the 6 criminals were disarmed, and the veterans were gaining the upper hand. But the battle was far from over. Sarah Martinez had managed to reach a phone in a different part of the building and was desperately trying to call for help. The landlines were still cut, but she had found an old emergency phone that connected directly to the fire department.
"This is Sunset Manor Nursing Home,"
she whispered urgently. "We have armed intruders in the building. Send police immediately." Back in the common room, Miguel Santos was proving that his military training had never really left him. Despite his age and the arthritis that normally slowed him down, he was moving with purpose and precision. When Webb tried to grab Red Patterson as a human shield, Santos intervened, using the captured gun to force Webb back. "You picked the wrong place to rob, son," Santos told Webb calmly. "We didn't survive the Korean War just to get pushed around by punks in our nursing home." Webb was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. These weren't helpless elderly people. These were combat veterans who had maintained their military mindset and their loyalty to each other. They were fighting not just for themselves, but for all the other residents and staff members in the building. Eddie Foster had positioned himself near the main hallway and was serving as an early warning system for the group. When he spotted Jake Sullivan limping toward the common room, nursing his injured hand from David Park's attack, Foster was ready. Using his walker as a weapon, he blocked Sullivan's path and created enough noise to alert the others. Sullivan was frustrated and in pain, but he still had his gun and was determined to regain control of the situation. "Get out of my way, old man," he shouted, pointing his weapon at Foster. But Foster had survived worse threats than this. During the Korean War, he had held a defensive position against overwhelming odds for 3 days until reinforcements arrived. One injured criminal with a gun didn't intimidate him. "Come and make me," Foster replied, adjusting his grip on his walker. The standoff lasted only seconds before Tommy Chen appeared behind Sullivan, moving quietly despite his own physical limitations. Chen had left Red Patterson and Miguel Santos to guard the 2 captured criminals and had come to help Foster. Working together, the 2 veterans managed to disarm Sullivan, bringing the total to 4 captured weapons. Now only Webb and Rivera still had guns, and they were separated in different parts of the building. Rivera was still trying to crack the safe in the administrator's office, but he was growing increasingly nervous as he heard the sounds of combat and his teammates' radio calls for help. Webb found himself surrounded in the common room by 8 determined veterans who had turned the furniture into defensive positions. He was skilled with weapons and had experience in street fights, but he had never faced anything like this. These men were using military tactics adapted to their current physical capabilities, and they were incredibly effective. Outside, the neighbors who had been awakened by the gunfire were calling police. The rural sheriff's department was 20 minutes away, but they were responding with all available units. The fire department had already relayed Sarah Martinez's emergency call, and additional law enforcement agencies were being notified. Frank Morrison could see that Webb was getting desperate, which made him more dangerous. Desperate criminals often make reckless decisions that can hurt innocent people. Morrison decided it was time to end this confrontation before anyone got seriously injured. "Webb," Morrison called out, having learned the criminal's name from radio conversations. "Your team is finished. 4 of your men are captured and police are on the way. You can surrender now and walk out of here, or you can keep fighting and see how this ends." Webb looked around the room at the 8 elderly men who had somehow turned his simple robbery into a military-style engagement. His easy target had become his worst nightmare. These veterans might have been old, but they were still soldiers and they had never learned how to give up. Webb's eyes darted around the common room looking for any advantage or escape route. He was trapped by 8 men who moved like a coordinated military unit despite their walkers, wheelchairs, and canes. The criminal leader had never encountered anything like this in his years of robbing businesses and intimidating victims. "You don't understand," Webb said, his voice cracking slightly. "I've got nothing to lose. If I'm going down, I'm taking some of you with me." Frank Morrison stepped forward, his military bearing unmistakable even at 89 years old. "Son, I've heard that threat before. Chinese soldiers said the same thing to us at Chosin Reservoir. We're still here. And they're not." The reference to one of the most brutal battles in American military history wasn't lost on Webb. He was beginning to realize that these weren't just elderly veterans telling war stories. These were men who had survived combat that most people couldn't even imagine. Meanwhile, Carlos Rivera had given up on the safe and was trying to reach his team leader. The radio chatter had become increasingly desperate, and Rivera could hear sounds of struggle throughout the building. He made the decision to abandon the robbery attempt and try to help Webb escape. As Rivera moved through the hallways toward the common room, he encountered David Park, who was helping Sarah Martinez and the other staff members secure the remaining residents in their rooms. Park saw Rivera coming and quickly positioned himself to block the criminal's path. "Not going anywhere," Park said simply, holding the gun he had taken from Dean Morris. Rivera raised his own weapon, but Park was ready for him. The 84-year-old veteran might not have been as fast as he once was, but he was smart and experienced. He used the hallway's layout to his advantage, forcing Rivera to expose himself while Park remained in a protected position. The two men faced each other in a tense standoff. Rivera was younger and stronger, but Park had something more valuable: decades of experience in life or death situations. Park knew how to read his opponent, how to stay calm under pressure, and how to wait for the right moment to act. In the common room, the other veterans were tightening their circle around Webb. Red Patterson had maneuvered his wheelchair to block the main exit, while Miguel Santos covered the back door. Tommy Chen and Eddie Foster had positioned themselves to prevent Webb from reaching any of the captured weapons. James Williams was guarding the 4 disarmed criminals, making sure they couldn't cause any more trouble. Despite his age and physical limitations, Williams projected an authority that kept the captured men subdued. They had learned not to underestimate these elderly veterans. Robert Kim was serving as the group's communications coordinator, keeping track of everyone's positions and watching for any new threats. His role might have seemed less dramatic than the others, but it was crucial for maintaining the coordination that had made their defense so effective. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder as police units approached the nursing home. Webb heard them too, and the approaching law enforcement made him even more desperate. He had to escape now, or he would be facing serious prison time for armed robbery and assault. "Last chance," Morrison told Webb. "Put down the gun and surrender. Your friends are already captured, and the police will be here in minutes. Don't make this worse for yourself." But Webb wasn't thinking rationally anymore. The failure of his carefully planned robbery, the unexpected resistance from elderly residents, and the approaching police sirens had pushed him beyond logical decision-making. He decided to make one final desperate attempt to shoot his way out. Webb fired 2 shots toward the ceiling, and then charged toward Red Patterson's wheelchair, hoping to break through the veteran's defensive line. But the 8 men had anticipated this possibility. They had fought together in Korea, and they knew how to respond to desperate enemy attacks. Patterson rolled his wheelchair aside at the last moment, while Tommy Chen stuck out his cane to trip Webb as he ran past. Webb stumbled and fell, his gun sliding across the floor toward Miguel Santos, who quickly secured it. Now all 6 criminals were disarmed and under the control of 8 elderly nursing home residents. The transformation was remarkable. Men who needed help with daily activities had successfully defended their home against armed intruders, using military tactics they had learned 60 years earlier. David Park's standoff with Rivera ended when the criminal heard Webb's capture over the radio. Realizing that the mission was completely lost and that police were approaching, Rivera made the decision to surrender rather than continue fighting an elderly man who clearly knew what he was doing. "I give up," Rivera said, slowly placing his gun on the floor. This whole thing was crazy from the start. Park kept his weapon trained on Rivera but nodded with approval. "Smart choice. You boys picked the wrong place to rob." Sarah Martinez emerged from her hiding place and began checking on the residents and staff to make sure everyone was safe. Amazingly, despite the gunfire and struggle, no one had been seriously injured. The veterans had managed to defend the nursing home without causing any casualties among the people they were protecting. The first police car arrived at exactly 11:47 p.m., followed quickly by additional units and an ambulance. Sheriff Tom Bradley had been expecting to find a nursing home full of traumatized elderly victims and injured staff members. Instead, he found 8 elderly men calmly guarding 6 captured criminals. What in the world happened here? Bradley asked Frank Morrison, who appeared to be the leader of the group. Morrison straightened his shoulders and gave a crisp, military response. Sir, 6 armed individuals attempted to rob this facility. We defended our position and secured the hostile forces. No friendly casualties to report. The sheriff stared at Morrison for a moment, then looked around the common room at the overturned furniture, the strategic positions the veterans had created, and the 6 captured criminals who looked like they had been through a military engagement. You men are Korean War veterans, aren't you? Bradley asked. Yes, sir, Morrison replied. We served together in the 7th Infantry Regiment. We might be old, but we never forgot our training. As the police took the criminals into custody and paramedics checked on everyone's health, the 8 veterans began cleaning up the common room and helping to calm the other residents. They moved efficiently and purposefully, just as they had during the battle. The nursing home staff watched in amazement as the men they had been caring for revealed a side of themselves that few people had ever seen. These weren't just elderly residents who needed help with medications and meals. They were heroes who had stepped up to protect their community when it was threatened. The news of what happened at Sunset Manor Nursing Home spread quickly through the local community and then across the nation. Within 24 hours, reporters from major news networks were arriving to interview the 8 Korean War veterans who had single-handedly defeated 6 armed robbers. Frank Morrison became the unofficial spokesperson for the group, though he insisted that all 8 men had contributed equally to their successful defense. We didn't do anything special, he told the first reporter who interviewed him. We just did what soldiers do. We protected the people who couldn't protect themselves. But the rest of the country disagreed with Morrison's modest assessment. The story captured the imagination of millions of Americans who were inspired by the courage and determination of these elderly heroes. Social media was filled with posts praising the veterans, and nursing home heroes became a trending topic on Twitter. The 6 criminals were charged with multiple felonies, including armed robbery, assault, and terroristic threatening. During their court appearances, even the prosecutor noted the irony that experienced criminals had been defeated by nursing home residents. Marcus Webb, the leader of the group, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The other 5 received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. What made the story even more remarkable was learning about the individual backgrounds of the 8 veterans. Frank Morrison had been awarded the Bronze Star for valor during the Korean War. Tommy Chen had served as a communications specialist and had been wounded twice in combat. Red Patterson had been a medic who had saved dozens of wounded soldiers under fire. Miguel Santos had been a demolitions expert who had destroyed enemy positions throughout the war. James Bulldog Williams had earned his nickname by refusing to retreat during a battle where his unit was outnumbered 10-1. Robert Kim had been a sniper who had protected his fellow soldiers from enemy attacks. Eddie Foster had been a supply sergeant who had kept his unit fed and equipped during the harsh Korean winter. David Park had been a reconnaissance specialist who had gathered intelligence behind enemy lines. Together, these 8 men represented centuries of military experience and a combined total of 17 military decorations for courage and service. They had served their country with distinction during one of America's most challenging conflicts, and they had never stopped being soldiers. The nursing home administration was initially concerned about the incident and the publicity it generated. However, the overwhelmingly positive response from the community and the nation changed their perspective. Sunset Manor became known as a place where American heroes lived, and families began specifically requesting placement for their elderly veteran relatives. The facility received donations from across the country, allowing them to upgrade their security systems and improve their recreational facilities. A local contractor volunteered to build a memorial garden honoring all the veterans who lived at the nursing home. The American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars organizations held special ceremonies to recognize the 8 heroes. Sarah Martinez, the night nurse who had been on duty during the robbery attempt, said the incident changed how she viewed the residents. I knew they were veterans, but I had never really understood what that meant until I saw them in action. These men have incredible strength and courage even at their age. The 8 veterans themselves seemed somewhat embarrassed by all the attention. They insisted they had simply done what anyone in their situation would have done. However, their families were incredibly proud. Children and grandchildren who had heard war stories for decades finally understood the true character of these remarkable men. Tommy Chen's granddaughter, Lisa, drove from California to visit him after hearing about the incident. Grandpa always told us stories about Korea, but we thought they were just old war tales. Now I realize he was a real hero, and he still is. The incident also brought the 8 men even closer together. They had always been friends, but defending the nursing home together had renewed the brotherhood they had forged in combat 60 years earlier. They began holding regular meetings to discuss their Korean War experiences and to help other veterans deal with post-war challenges. Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who specializes in veteran issues, visited the nursing home to interview the 8 men. She was amazed by their mental toughness and their continued sense of duty. These men demonstrate that military training and values don't disappear with age. When their community needed them, they responded exactly as they had been trained to do decades ago. The story inspired other nursing homes to learn more about their veteran residents and to create programs that honored their military service. Veterans across the country began sharing their own stories of continued service and community involvement well into their senior years. 6 months after the incident, the 8 veterans were invited to Washington, D.C. to meet with military leaders and government officials. They were recognized in a special ceremony at the Pentagon, where they received commendations for their civilian service and their continued representation of military values. During the ceremony, Frank Morrison was asked to speak on behalf of his 7 comrades. "We appreciate this recognition, but we want people to remember that there are thousands of veterans in nursing homes and senior communities across America. They all have stories of service and sacrifice. We were just lucky enough to have the opportunity to show that we're still soldiers." The nursing home created a small museum displaying the military medals, photographs, and memorabilia of all their veteran residents. School groups began visiting to learn about the Korean War and to meet the 8 heroes who had defended their home with the same courage they had shown on foreign battlefields. Red Patterson summed up the group's feelings about the incident during one interview. "People keep calling us heroes, but we were just doing our job. A soldier's job doesn't end when he retires or gets old. We protect people. That's what we do. And that's what we'll keep doing as long as we're able." The 8 Korean War Marines had proven that heroism doesn't have an expiration date. Their successful defense of Sunset Manor Nursing Home became a symbol of the enduring values of service, courage, and sacrifice that define America's military veterans. They had never surrendered in Korea, and they hadn't surrendered in Tennessee either.